Hey folks, Dust here, and I wanted to discuss some key takeaways from the recent ELEAGUE Invitational tournament here at the beginning of 2019 as kind of a precursor to the major that's coming up at IEM Katowice. Of course, we had 4 teams at this event. It was FaZe, a top 5 team in the world in the current rankings. You had Cloud9, who is now number 10 after this event, Big, who is just outside of the top 10, and then Complexity, who's just outside of the top 30. And really just what I want to do in this video is not look at all the matches in crazy detail, but really just kind of talk about how these teams looked at the event, what it might mean for their future going forward, and just kind of look at things from that perspective. So without further ado, let's jump into it, and we'll start off by looking at Complexity. Now, Complexity is a team that, of course, made a ton of noise because of their run at the FaZe Major, but everything leading up into that event, with the exception of the Americas Minor, wasn't really that great. And the follow-up to the FaZe Major for them also really, fell short of what they were hoping for. They had the really rough group stage exits at DreamHack Winter. They had that Starlighter Season 6 group stage exits that also looked pretty rough. They had some okay runs at DreamHack Atlanta and CS Summit 3, but all in all, they were not satisfied with those results, and fair enough. After what you did at the FaZe Major, they were certainly hoping for more, and so they brought in nothing as kind of a temporary fifth with maybe an option to extend his contract later, and then they picked up Ricky. And at the iBuyPower Masters event, they did not do well at all. They took a huge loss to Astralis on Dust 2. Then they had that close loss to Fnatic as well on Train. Now, granted, it was 2 best-of-1s. It was against some top-ranked teams in the world, particularly Astralis' #1 team in the world. And it was their first event together with limited practice, so you can't really look too much into it. But then they come into this event and they take a huge loss to Big in the opening best-of-3, 0-2. They had a close game on Overpass, but then got blown out on Cash. And then they played FaZe, who kind of got upset by Cloud9 in that opening best-of-3. And so when they played FaZe in the elimination best-of-3 for the tournament, they had a closer game on Train, but then had another blowout loss on Cash. Overall, Ricky really struggled at this event and really struggled at iBuyPower Masters as well. This guy was supposed to be adding firepower to this team. I mean, he looked pretty good on Rogue. He certainly had his moments with CLG, and then obviously coming from Renegades. I felt that this guy would be an upgrade. I felt he was a good enough hybrid, definitely a secondary opping threat that Complexity didn't really have before he joined the team. Definitely could do some aggressive rifling. So I felt like he would be a good add to this team for Ye, who had been struggling to perform after the major. But that didn't really come to fruition at either of these tournaments. He really did struggle to put numbers on the board, and I think that that's definitely kind of scary when you consider the fact that this is a lot that Complexity is going to be running at the major, and they're trying to defend a top 8 status. And look, I don't think anybody has, the slightest thought that Complexity is going to be able to defend that legend spot, except for maybe the Complexity organization themselves. But I think even if they're being realistic, they probably should know that that's going to be really tough to do. So the fact that kind of one of the main pieces that you brought on to be an upgrade in firepower to the team isn't really doing that. And I'm not sure why, because I would have expected a little bit more from Ricky based on, what I had seen from him coming into this team. I actually thought he would do quite well, so I'm kind of surprised to see that didn't really come to fruition. Really, no one performed particularly great. I mean, some people had some games, like Stanislaw still can have some good games, Stan can still have some good games. Even Nothing had a couple of good games. But it does lead the question, is this the 5th that Complexity really needs, and is Ricky even the 4th that they really need if he's not going to be able to perform? I think that, I can't blame the organization. They tried to get Tarek. They tried to bring in star power. They just weren't able to make that signing. And so they put what was the best team they could reasonably put together for the major. And these first 2 tournaments as kind of a tune-up for the major haven't really looked the way that they wanted to, I imagine. Now, granted, the major is still the big thing. They've had a few weeks now after the ELEAGUE Invitational before the major to try to work things out. But I would say that Complexity look in a lot of trouble to really do much at this major. And then after the major's over, they're going to have some decisions to make on how they want to structure their lineup. Because, here's the thing. Would Nothing even want to stay? He could be so successful as a content creator and streamer, a personality, whether he wants to do analyst desk or something like that, or just whatever. I feel like his brand, his personality, he could really do whatever the hell he wants, I feel like. So is joining this team permanently something he really wants to do at this stage in his life? I'm not really sure. And even if he did, is he the 5th that you really need? I feel like this team is in dire need of a star player. You have a great in-game leader and Stanislaw, who's also a pretty good fragging in-game leader. You have Shazam, pretty stable opper. There's not really many options to upgrade him, even if you wanted to, especially within the North American region. And then, you have Def, who is kind of a supportive type player, maybe helps with the leadership of the team. They see a lot in him. You know, I thought that maybe Android should have stayed and he should have gone, to be perfectly honest, but the organization and the team see a lot in him. Maybe there are things that I just can't see that he does do for the team. But yeah, I mean, this team's in a hell of a lot of trouble. So, I mean, they have been pretty transparent about maybe making moves after the major anyway. But yeah, again, I guess all in all, I just can't see them doing much of the major after what I've seen at these events. It would be pretty crazy if they did. It would be a pretty big turnaround. And yeah, they're going to have to really kind of get back to the drawing board after the major to figure out how to tune up this team, because I think there's some good foundational pieces in a Stanislaw and in a Shazam in particular. But then after that, I feel like you really have to kind of think about the direction of your team going forward. And so we'll just leave it at that for complexity. So now we'll get into Big, and of course this was their debut with Xantares, with Next being out for surgery and Xantares coming in. I did a whole video about Big leading up to that roster change and the roster change itself, so I'm not really going to go into that. I'll put a link in the description below next to this timestamp if you want to, you know, hear more thoughts about Big from me and about Xantares joining the team. But anyway, they weren't at Power Masters or anything else before this event. This was their debut, and they opened up the tournament. I already kind of talked about it, you know, beating Complexity, that close game with Overpass, but then the blowout on Cash. And then they go play Cloud9 in the upper bracket final for a shot at a grand finals appearance. And they lose both these games 14-16. And these were some rough losses because on Cash, they had a 12-3 lead coming off of their CT side. And then C9 just makes the comeback with Big struggling to close out this game. And it wasn't even that they had some type of structural issue. It was literally just a bunch of crazy comedy of errors. You know, Tizian wasn't able to kill a diffuser one round with a deagle, despite the fact that he had a big opportunity to get the kill. There was this really weird 4v3 post plan on B that they lost, where they had the advantage. Gabi was even pushed up in the tree, close to CT spawn, really denying a lot of space, but he was kind of alone. Didn't really have someone maybe playing the connector that could help him or something like that. And then someone just, I think Xantares was just hiding outside a window in middle and just got shot in the back. I think it was like by Rush with an SMG, just wasn't paying attention to his back because he was watching Highway. And so there was these weird rounds like that where it was just like, man, like these mistakes really cost you the game. They should have won this map. There's no question about it. There was some really weird rounds that did not go their way. And so, yeah, then they go on the map 2, which is Overpass. They had some leads in this game as well. They were up 6-4 at one point on the T side in the first half. They wound up having about a 13-10 lead in the second half from their CT side. But Smooya had a really rough game here with the AWP. Didn't really get going at all. Tizian also had a rough one, even for his standards. We don't really expect him to be a big fragger, but even for his standards, this was pretty poor. And so they had a couple of guys just off, and you feel like if one of those guys turn up or both of them turn up a little bit more, then they don't wind up losing this game. You know, again, they had leads. This one, I mean, there was a couple of mistakes here and there, but it wasn't nearly as, you know, egregious as their errors on Cash. All in all, they just wound up losing a close game. So that's rough. So then they go and they play against FaZe in the lower bracket final for a chance to still get back into the grand finals, or, you know, obviously eliminations on the line. And they have a really close loss on Cash. They only got 5 rounds in the first half on their T side. They just kind of kept getting shutting down by individual plays. Like I remember Rain had like a crazy hat trick round where he was hiding inside some smokes inside the A bomb site and busted out, got like 3 kills in the round. And there was a couple of little things like that that kind of shut them down on their T side. Maybe some other stuff, but again, I don't want to get into crazy detail. But then they made a little bit of a comeback on the CT side, just not enough, and so they wound up losing that game 14-16. Which they had just lost 2 games against Cloud9, 14-16, so some really close losses here for Big throughout this tournament. Then they win Train in close fashion, another 16-14 game for Big. This is pretty out of control. I mean, outside the Complexity series, they just had so many close games this tournament. And, you know, just had a really big lead on CT side of Train and were able to close out, despite the fact that FaZe made the game a little bit close on their own CT side. And then you go to Inferno, and this is the game where they just could not get going on their T side in the first half. They got the 3-0 start off of winning Pistol, and then that was really about it. They just couldn't get anything else going. FaZe is kind of just suffocating CT play with just so many skilled players. I mean, that's what they were always really well known for, is being able to have really big CT sides. That happens here again, and just ultimately can't get the win, despite the fact that they did close the gap a little bit on their own CT side. In this particular series, Xantares, despite the fact he looked really good against Complexity and Cloud9, he really struggled against FaZe, particularly on the Inferno game was the game he really went missing. I think that was pretty crucial because he is supposed to be that added firepower to Big. And so I think him, you know, going missing a little bit in the series, and particularly Inferno, I think was one of the things that hurt this team. But again, I'm not scapegoating him. There's a bunch of other things that caused him not to be able to win this series. That's just something to kind of think about. To stay on the topic of Xantares, to kind of conclude about this tournament and what it means for Big's outlook, I felt like Xantares had kind of a neutral event because, look, he played really well against Complexity, but I mean, that's expected. You know, that team looked really weak at Allied Power Masters. They're going through a big change. They were already struggling leading into their roster change. So I think the expectation was for you to perform against Complexity and for the team to do well against Complexity. So I guess you don't really gain a lot of points there. I mean, you did your job, so you don't lose any value, but you didn't really gain a lot of value. But he did play really well against Cloud9. And Cloud9 had a couple of moments at Allied Power Masters. They even had a couple of moments, you know, without Zelsis whenever they played that Lisbon event at Blast where they had a couple of cool maps. But all in all, I mean, still not like a crazy big name team. But I mean, this does give them a little bit of credit. Just, you didn't really get any for Complexity. You don't get that much credit, but you do get some credit for playing well against Cloud9, as they are a team that is still reasonably pretty good. But the fact that he wasn't able to perform against FaZe, like the main competition in a tournament, I mean, that is a little bit disappointing. I mean, none of the maps, like none of the 3 maps, even the map that Big won, he didn't really have that crazy of impact. So I feel like this is kind of a neutral event just because he played so well against Complexity and Cloud9, but just didn't turn up against FaZe. I mean, again, it is his debut event, and that's another big thing. Like, you can't really, you know, get on him too hard. I mean, he's having to adjust a lot, you know, having to maybe communicate in English instead of his native language, you know, having to get used to a team he hasn't maybe had that much practice with, you know, cultural differences, moving to a new country. I mean, there's so many different things that's going on with him adjusting that I don't even want him to be too critical yet. I mean, I think he needs a lot more time before we really know the conclusion of this move, but all in all, at least you saw some positive signs. I felt like he was implemented correctly. It's like the other big point I want to make about Xantares on Big from this tournament. He did get some active roles, which is the way he needed to be used, because that's how he was used on Space Soldiers. That's what he's comfortable doing. That's how he performs. He entered a lot with Tabson, you know, on the A-bomb side on Cast, for instance, on their A executes. He was working B on Inferno, a pretty active role to have to try to get that B control. He was entering on, you know, B-bomb side executes with Tabson and God B on Overpass. So he was in the right role. I feel like they implemented him really well. And so I think that's definitely a good sign for Big's future. It also seemed like Tabson wasn't too rocked by what they wanted to do to implement Xantares. I mean, he stayed active in his own right. He was paired up with Xantares, like I said already, on maps like Cash and Overpass, kind of entering together. He did go back to apartments on Inferno because he had been attacking B for a little while. Him and Next kind of swapped, and some things were happening before this roster change. So he kind of just goes back to an old position, but he's still used pretty actively. He's like kind of the one jumping window, attacking boilers, still attacking in the top middle. It's not like he's just lurking on the balcony or something like that. He's still pretty active even if he's not at B anymore. He still could be active on executes there. So I felt like they did a good job of getting Xantares good roles, but not necessarily hamstringing Tabson in the process. It was a pretty good balance there. So I thought that was good. And again, I think that overall they looked good. Like, tactically speaking, they looked pretty good. I think this is the best you could expect from them, given the situation, given it's their first event with Xantares and all the adjustments they're having to make. I think that it was still fine. I mean, it wasn't great. Like, making the finals would have been fantastic. I think a second place for Big here would have been the goal. Obviously, the win's the goal, but I think second place is, like, you know, still would have given them a lot of credit if they were able to do that. Again, from an eye test, they just look sharp. You know, again, they just made some really critical errors against Cloud9. They should have won that series. They should have been the ones, you know, sitting in the grand finals after they beat Cloud9. So with that in mind, you know, you fix up some of those errors, this tournament goes a lot differently for Big. It's what I keep kind of going back to. So all in all, I actually think that Big's future looks pretty bright. I thought this was, you know, from an eye test, a decent showing from them, even if the results aren't necessarily there. They did have some results at least. Did take a map off of FaZe. Did look pretty strong against Cloud9, despite the fact that they made key errors to lose. And so I'm definitely excited about seeing Big's future with this team. With that, we'll move on to Cloud9. So Cloud9 is a team that has been through a lot of chaos. I mean, they've had a different fifth for like 3 or 4 tournaments in a row until they had Zelsis back-to-back for Power Masters in this ELEAGUE Invitational. You know, the whole Finesse in and out, Sticko in and out, the whole situation with Golden, Automatic having to become an opper, Flusha having to become the in-game leader. Like, there's so many moving parts on this team that they're really hard to put your thumb on. They haven't had a playoff run since DreamHack Masters Marseille when Tarek and Finesse were still on the team. So many group stage exits. Granted, those Blast events are kind of like a different type of group stage, so it's a little bit different. And this event didn't even really have a group stage. It was just a double elimination bracket. So, yeah, I mean, at Allied Power Masters, their debut with Zelsis, they traded some games with Fnatic. They had a big one on Overpass to them, but then lost a close one on Mirage, and obviously they lost to Astralis in the middle of that. At the event, though, I felt like some of the individuals had stepped up that had been struggling. You know, Rush looked a lot better at this iPower Masters event compared to some of the stuff prior. Keo still looked on point. I think he's been one of the best fraggers and most consistent players on this team outside of Automatic. Flusha looked a lot better at this event. I mean, I think he had been going negative 11 tournaments in a row before iPower Masters, and at this event, he looked a lot stronger. You know, Automatic was as good as you could expect. I mean, he's definitely taken a little bit of a hit because he's not in his main role, or he's still doing pretty well. In fact, I guess I'll say it here, and I might reiterate it later. I actually think that he's done better than I would have expected becoming the primary opper. Like, he's actually been quite effective in some ways and impactful in some ways, where I would have thought that the adjustment actually wouldn't have been this good. I mean, again, I still think that at the end of the day, he'd be much better off just getting back to his main rifling roles. I think he'd put up bigger numbers. I think he'd be even more impactful. But all in all, you know, given the situation, it's actually gone better than I thought. And then for Zelsis, it's kind of a neutral event, you know? Like, he didn't do terrible. He had a couple of games that didn't look that great, but he had a one good game, and I didn't really expect a whole lot. This is a huge step up in competition for him. I thought it was neutral for him. It was fine. So then we go into this event, and they had that close 2-0 over FaZe to open the event. You know, it's overtime on Overpass. They had a huge T-side, 12-3 lead. So they allow FaZe to come back and put it into overtime, but then they wound up winning it there. They won both pistols this game, which is really helpful, especially in a close game like this, at least to make sure that you ensure overtime. Good overall numbers from all 5 players. You know, definitely hurt that they let the comeback happen, but at least they got the job done. And then, you know, Mirage was also an overtime game, but it wasn't like some type of choking or allowing some type of comeback. It was just in general a closer game where each team had like 9 CT rounds, 6 T rounds, close games. Again, Cloud9 won both pistols here, which really certainly helped. They generally were always getting good starts to each half they played in this series. And again, numbers-wise, generally speaking, you know, pretty good overall numbers for everyone. Couldn't say much here. Then we go to the big game, and we already really talked about this from Big's perspective, so I don't really want to reiterate it. I mean, I think they got really fortunate that Big made some mistakes. I think they probably should have lost this series. I think they should have at least lost Cash for sure, and that should have been a 3-mapper. Maybe they still win Overpass. So they get that series over Big. One of the things to take from this series, though, is that Rush was having some quiet games again, and so I'm a little bit concerned about him still going forward. Zelsa struggled a bit on one of the maps, but then played really well on Overpass. So again, we're seeing still kind of, we're not really sure about Zelsa. It's still kind of neutral to me. Rest of everyone played fine. They played a lot of Counter-Strike. They played all 30 rounds in the maps versus Big, and then they played 2 overtimes against FaZe. They played a lot of Counter-Strike in 4 maps, making it hard on themselves. Then they wait in the finals and they play against FaZe, and they murder FaZe on Mirage. Holy shit. 14 CT rounds in the first half. Don't let FaZe do anything. Just murked them on this map. And this is looking really dangerous. But then we all know that FaZe wins the next 2 maps in Inferno and Train pretty comfortably, and so Cloud9 wound up just taking a second place at this event. Again, I thought Zelsis had a pretty neutral event, or neutral series against FaZe, I should say, and Automatic had a really rough game on Train in particular, but then some of the other guys had their moments, right? Now, I don't want to talk about the other 2 maps in the finals because I'm going to kind of say that when I talk about FaZe, but just some key takeaways for Cloud9. Again, I'm still not really sure what Zelsis is going to be for this team. You know, I'm not even sure if that is the permanent option. I mean, obviously at the major, he's probably going to play. I don't think Golden's going to be able to make it back for the major, but we don't know. I mean, I think Zelsis got listed as a coach, and Golden's still on the lineup, so they still might use Golden. I think that is the situation that has to get sorted out before I can really know what Cloud9 is going to look like going forward. You know, we have to know if Golden's going to be the in-game leader. I will say this, as Flusha has been the in-game leader, they actually haven't looked too bad. I mean, I think their T-sides are still pretty well run. I mean, there's a couple little mishaps here and there. They tend to be more explosive and fast-paced, but they actually do have these rounds where they do just kind of sit back and play default and kind of make mid-round decision-making, and it actually doesn't look that bad. I mean, obviously they probably would maybe look better with Golden as the in-game leader, a guy who's more suited to that role, but I don't feel like they've taken a crazy hit there. Again, I think the biggest issues with Cloud9 is that, I'm still scared for Rush. He's actually back into a primary entry fragging role. He's getting all kind of the entry spots you'd imagine you'd get, you know, entering AM mid on Cash, being a part of the mid-control attack group on Mirage. He's getting those old roles back, the roles he had when he was on Optic, when he was a star-level player. I mean, he kind of made a sacrifice on Cloud9 with the players that they had, kind of taking more supportive spots on T-side. So, yeah, I'm a little bit concerned because I would see some flashes from him. Like, I'd see some big games from him again, and I was like, oh, man, like, if Rush can get to a consistent star level, it would make Cloud9, you know, a super good team, I feel like, especially with how well Keo's playing, the fact that Automatic's doing all right with the AWP, and when you run 5 rifle setups, he's going to be a huge factor. So, man, if he could just get consistent, I think that would help out Cloud9 loads, but he's still having his issues. I think that's kind of a big talking point. Again, the whole Golden situation is a big talking point. Again, it's too soon to call for Zelsis. A big adjustment to a much higher level of competition, only 2 events with the team, so I'm still not sure what he's going to be like for this team. And so that's kind of where I'm at. I'm still left wondering what Cloud9's going to do as a team. I mean, I think that they have enough of a structure and enough, you know, firepower to where if they pop off, they can be mad dangerous and get some map wins you might not expect them to be able to get. Again, I think Keo's been really consistent. I think Flush is actually fragging quite well and leading pretty decent. I mean, obviously, it's not like this is his first rodeo as an in-game leader. He did it for Fnatic for a time period, but that's not what he was recruited for, and it's not something he's ever really done long-term. So the fact that it's gone all right, you know, is actually somewhat to be applauded. And so I'll just kind of leave it at that. I mean, I do also think that Cloud9 would still be better off with a different operant and automatic and primary rifling roles. So that's another thing to think about going forward. But yeah, I mean, I think they'll do all right at the major. And so with that, we'll finish up the video by talking about FaZe. So I talked a lot about FaZe's 2018 in my iBuyPower Masters preview video. So if you're interested in kind of my thoughts on FaZe's 2018 and kind of what they look like coming into this tournament and in this roster change with the drink coming in for Kerrigan, I will link in the description below a timestamp from that video that talks about FaZe if you want to do it. But anyway, the iBuyPower Masters thing for them, yeah, it was rough tournament conditions. Had to play in what was going to be the warm-up area. None of their games were streamed. I didn't get to watch them, so I don't really know anything about that event for them other than what you all know, which is that they lost 2 games to Ghost on Train and got eliminated in the group stage. Obviously, very disappointing result. They were certainly supposed to make it out of groups at that event. They were even maybe a favorite to make the finals, depending on who they matched up against in the semis. So that was definitely a big disappointment. So then they come into this ELEAGUE Invitational, and we're a little bit concerned about how shaky they might be. They had those close overtime losses to Cloud9 in the opening series, which we already kind of talked about, so I'm not going to do that. They breezed through Complexity the next game. Again, I already kind of talked about that. Then, of course, they had the close 2-1 series win against Big. And again, I've already kind of mentioned that on when I talked about Big. In general, though, I'll just kind of mention here right away that, again, they're still having these struggles on T side, man. I mean, I know that now they have like a non-traditional in-game leader calling the shots, but, man, they just look a little bit disjointed at times. And maybe they just need more time with Nico calling and more time with Yenko coaching to kind of help fix some of the errors. But sometimes you just see someone go for something with just no support, no trade capability. They just get stranded, and they kind of put themselves in these weird situations sometimes, and it just at least just kind of scratch your head a little bit like, man, what if you kind of work this together a little bit better? It's almost just like the chemistry isn't there. You know, it's fine if you want to play a looser, more aggressive style of play, or maybe spread your players and just try to take fights all across the map and be really dangerous all across the map, but it just seems like some of the mid-round decision-making still is a little bit rough at times. I think the biggest thing is not even the mid-round decision-making. If they can actually play themselves into a 4-on-4 or 3-on-3, they actually do okay in these situations. It's more of sometimes they'll just lose a player really early in a round in some weird way, and they just go into a 4-on-5, and then, well, you're at a disadvantage the rest of the round. So there's just some little things like that, and just overall, I feel like they're not getting as many T rounds as I would hope they will with the talent they have. But that's just kind of one thing I kind of noticed throughout the big series. But then they had the finals against Cloud9, and they have no T-side to speak of on Mirage. I already kind of talked about that from the Cloud9 perspective. Again, just sometimes things look a little bit off. They just don't... I feel like they're one-dimensional in some ways, at least on this Mirage situation. I mean, just a lot of 1-4 attacks, a lot of fast-paced executes. They don't really do a whole lot of 1-3-1 default mid-control. They really just rely on the faster-paced hits, you know, like 4 guys running mid with 1 guy outside A, or, you know, 4 file 5 hitting A, or, you know, these 4 apartments out of B, 1 guy up cat. These fast explosive executes can be very effective if the coordination's really good, if you're trading efficiently. That type of play can work out really well, and it's very useful to have that style of play, and FaZe can make it work, but I feel like you have to have more. I mean, when you think about all of the more tactical teams that are very successful, like an Astralis, like a Liquid, maybe even like an NRG, you know, made in Brazil to a degree. I think their big thing was late round situations, not the early and mid round. They're very capable of shifting through different gears and being a little bit more versatile on their T side. And I feel like FaZe is still kind of on a 1-speed T side. I do see some signs of them starting to form some defaults on a couple of maps, like Cash, for instance, is probably one of the big ones I noticed that they did have a little bit more. But on a map like Mirage, that's a map that they still really struggle on. I think their Inferno is also reasonably okay. But yeah, Mirage is the one that still kind of makes me scratch my head a little bit. And there is still some things on Inferno that do get really weird. I remember watching one round where Rain just kind of walks in B by himself and dies while everyone's still just kind of taking basic mid control. And it's just like, you know, I don't know. It just seems like some things look a little bit disjointed there, and I hope that they figured it out. Either way, they still wound up winning the tournament despite all these things I'm talking about. You know, they, in the second map against Cloud after losing open map on Mirage, they get a really strong first half CT start on Inferno. They struggled on T getting going, but they did wind up getting those last rounds they needed towards the very end of the game. Huge game from Olaf here, despite the fact that Nico was quiet. Everyone else played pretty well. Then on Train, they got the huge T side. They got 11 rounds on the T side in the first half of Train, so this was a much better looking T side, a much more successful T side. Closed out on CT pretty easily. Guardian went bonkers on this map. 34 kills, explosive plays, that 1v4 clutch. I mean, it was against Pistols, but still he had an op, and he was getting pushed, and he figured out a way to make it happen. He was almost double the amount of kills of anyone else on his team, and it's just that reminder that there's so much firepower on FaZe. You know, if Nico goes off like he normally does, he's a huge piece. If Guardian pops off like he did in this game, man, they just get so dangerous. So that's just kind of a reminder. Overall view for FaZe for the tournament, again, some struggles on T side still they need to work through, but I think that they still are really dangerous, really explosive, and have a lot of firepower. One of the things I noticed about this team at this tournament was Nico was a lot more active on T sides. He wasn't door anymore on Cash, a classic position for Nico. He was leading things just in general, you know, a little bit more of an entry fragger. And from what I understand from talking with him, this is kind of what he wanted to do. Get more involved, be more of a secondary entry fragger. And so that is what he's doing on a lot of these maps. So that was kind of a tactical adjustment that we've seen with this new version with FaZe. For Adren, his implementation, it was a mixed bag. In a lot of ways, he took over Nico's old spots. Like, he took over door on Cash. He took over playing outside A on Mirage. So those are two spots that Nico used to play. So he kind of filled in those types of roles where he could still be a little bit active, but he still wasn't like a part of the main entry group like he was with Gambit. He was also playing apartments on Inferno, which is really odd for him because he normally would, you know, play Boiler and play mid, but that's kind of what Rain's doing and what he's done for a while now. So that was a map where he took a little bit more of a back seat in comparison to maybe some other maps. He doesn't really have too many one-to-one spots from like what he did on Gambit, except for Overpass. That was the exception. He does play basically the same spot he played on Gambit on Overpass. He's paired up with Nico, attacking A. Rain's a little bit more inside the connector, even though he was more of an entry A and bathroom. So Rain actually is the one who made a big adjustment on Overpass in particular to kind of give up a spot for Nico and Adren to have spots they're comfortable in, but he can still be involved even though he's playing from the stairwell. So those are just kind of some quick tactical notes on how Adren's being implemented, how Nico's roles have shifted, how Rain has shifted on at least one or two maps, and how Olaf's role has also kind of become a little bit more solidified. You know, he's still very flexible, so I still expect him to kind of flex around, but man, he was so effective kind of playing those lurk type of spots. So anyway, that's all I want to talk about. Just kind of wanted to break down these four teams from the ELEAGUE Invitational. Gives you something to think about as they head into the major on what to expect. Hope you folks enjoyed this content. If you did, please subscribe for more. Catch you next time.